Welcome back to Quintessence Virtual Retreat Spiritual Journey. I'm so honored to be joined with Anna Yusim. She is a psychiatrist and author of Fulfilled. Um, I'm just so thankful you can join our discussion around how really seeing our life from the perspective of a spiritual journey can transform how we are living our life and really uplift our daily lives. And I would love to start by just breathing in and grounding into our bodies and opening sacred space together. I'd like to just take a moment to invite our participants to set their own personal intention for our time together. This way, as you're listening to the conversation, you can really be like extracting nuggets of wisdom that really apply to where you're at in your own personal life at this time. And I also really want to thank you. Thank you for taking this time in your life and putting your intention into your spiritual essence and how that can more fluidly come and be part of your daily life. And with that, Anna, would you share with us a bit about your work?
Sure. Thank you, Maggie, for having me. I'm a psychiatrist in Manhattan and in Connecticut, and I'm on the clinical faculty at Yale Medical School, which is where I went to medical school. My interest area is integration between spirituality and mental health. And so I help my patients to connect to the deepest part of themselves through both psychological tools, psychiatric tools if needed, such as medication, and certainly spiritual tools. And spiritual tools include all sorts of things like tapping into your intuition, connecting to your divine essence, harnessing your personal power, transforming fear to love and faith, and things of that nature.
Yeah, so I want to just start out by sharing. I think that this is so beautiful that, especially like of a highest institution like Yale, is really looking at this combination between spirituality and mental health, right? Because I think that if we are just an individual living this experience, it leads to a disharmony often within our mental health because we can often feel very alone. We don't have the resources to cope with trauma and shock, things of this nature. And also, I think it can be a little bit disorientating, like why are we here? What is our purpose? Where are we going? Right? Without some kind of spiritual context to our life, we're just kind of like a to-do list, right? Every day it's just a list of things to do and achieve, and there isn't really this greater sense of like, maybe I need to be and experience my life as well. And I grew up and had a lot of mental health issues very early on, which is actually what led me into spirituality. And I was actually prescribed Paxil when I was 16. And I immediately, I always had a very strong spiritual awareness since I was young and connection with nature. And I didn't know where my depression, at this time it was depression, I didn't know where it was coming from. Like everything on the outside looked fine, right? And so I was prescribed Paxil, and my parents were very much like pressured, like you need to take this, and you were prescribed it, and it's to help you. And but when I would take it, I would feel like I couldn't even feel my feelings. Like I didn't even feel depressed anymore. I just like literally felt like I couldn't even feel, like I couldn't feel. And that was my own personal experience of the medication. And so I ended up saying, I'm sorry, I can't take this, because my intuition was saying, if I take this, I'm never going to know what's underneath the depression for myself, because I didn't know where it was coming from. Now I know that it actually was coming from a history of sexual abuse that my own mind had blocked from myself, right? In order, because it couldn't process it and I didn't have resources. And so I'm bringing this about because I ended up, I grew up in Des Moines, Iowa, a very, let's say, homogenous culture, right? And I somehow found this little yoga studio. Like, and I'm 40, so this was 24 years ago. And it was Kripalu based, which is a very like emotionally based yoga practice. And I started going to yoga, and my friends were like, what's going on with you? Because they actually would notice a huge shift in my mental health. And so I'm bringing this because I think that for mental health, I think that medication, I'm not against anything in life personally. I think that medication, it can be a really useful tool in certain situations. And I'm not asking you to really get into the medication part, but I think that incorporating some kind of spiritual practice actually helps you to like evolve in the long term. Whereas medication, I think, is more palliative care, like it helps in the moment a little bit more. And that then with this, when you add in the spiritual part, you really start evolving as a full human, basically. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that a bit.
Definitely, yeah. And thank you so much, Maggie, for sharing your very personal story. And it's beautiful that you were able to overcome some of the mental health challenges you had, really first by trying the medication, realizing it's not for you, realizing the effect that it had on you, which was to block your feelings, and then recognizing what was underneath, which was this trauma history. So I think stories like that, they are indeed, beautiful and a testament to the fact that, not everybody needs medications. And sometimes indeed medications can block you from what's really going on inside. So I have seen that many times, and patients often will come to me to get off of their medications for those reasons, or because they're like, I have been on medications for all these years. I've been feeling good. I think I could do this. I think I have other tools under my belt. And how do I do that?
Mhm.
So and then on the other hand, I've also seen people who are, the whole other side, deeply spiritual, doing everything that they need to do, doing yoga, doing meditation, doing their soul searching, having done their trauma work, having drank their green juices, biking and cycling, and they still have symptoms that are difficult to control. And in that case, they come, they're like, I've done everything. I think really my next step is to try medication. And we try medication and their life changes. And so it's a whole, the exact other way. They've done everything. And it's not, if they have dug as far as they can without the medication, they're like, okay, this is a tool in the toolbox. And this is all to say that healing isn't a one step, a one, size fits all approach or a one stop shop by any stretch. Healing is different for everybody. I'm not pro medication. I'm not anti medication. I'm pro healing. And, with every patient that comes in, it's so important to meet them where they're at and to understand what their perspective is and what experiences have led them there. And so your story is just a beautiful testament to that. And I thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for hearing it. So when you hear like spiritual journey, what does that kind of conjure up for you?
Yeah, for me, it means that which has opened people up to their own awakening. And what is an awakening? And what is spirituality actually? So, my definition of spirituality is a connection to something greater than oneself. For some people, that's God. For some people, it's the universe, to source, to Mother Nature, to universal consciousness, to our collective unconscious, or to even a set of collective global values that are indicative of consciousness elevation, like peace and perseverance and faith and love. Whatever that is, whatever your something greater is, having that and recognizing that life is more than just here and now, that there is something greater and that we can connect to that greater source is a very powerful and transcendent experience. Now, it's not to say that you want to just get away and transcend. We also have to be present and be in the here and now. And so often spirituality, as much as it is transcendence and connecting to something greater, it's also learning how to be more here, more mindful, more present. So it's really balancing those two things. that enables us to live more fully.
Yeah, right. It's like the going up and out, and then also the out and in, right?
Exactly. Mhm.
Because sometimes you hear of people who have profound spiritual experiences, but then it can be very difficult to integrate back into life sometimes from that. And
Exactly.
I attended two different spiritually based colleges. I attended Maharishi University of Management, which is Vedic science based, and I attended Naropa University. And when I graduated, I felt very strongly like I need to bring this, like, I need to leave these communities to actually like do the work of my being a spiritual warrior, so to speak, because I saw so many people, which is beautiful. There's no judgment around this, but I saw so many people where, because we were in these communities of empaths, of spiritual people, they were like scared to go outside of those communities, right? Because there was such a like safe, nurturing quality. And I'm bringing this up because I think sometimes in our culture, it can be hard to be a very spiritually or empathic person. And then how do you integrate into the culture so that you um, are able to be like a functional person, right? And finding your own way. Is there anything you'd want to speak to around that? Like,
Absolutely. And I love what you're saying because spirituality really, it could be, but it isn't only sitting meditating on a mountaintop or within your close community of other spiritual seekers. It's going out into the world. And I love the term that you use, warrior, because often spirituality is a war. And that war isn't with that which is outside of ourselves, though sometimes it can seem that way. Usually that war is that which with that which is inside ourselves. And that is often the war between our soul and our ego. Now, ego has multiple manifestations, and the manifestations of ego include anger, hatred, jealousy, greed, control, pride, things of that nature. We all know them. They're all part of being human. We're not going to eradicate those parts of our being, but it's really important to know those parts of our being because it's dangerous to let those parts control us and lead our life. The other part, the soul part, is what often will be fighting or warring with our ego. And the qualities of soul are peace and maturity and love and perseverance and patience and kindness and forgiveness. So we can, be angry or we can be kind. We can be fearful or we can be loving and faithful. We could be resentful and vengeful or we could be forgiving. So we always have that choice. And over time, the more that we're able to align with our soul as opposed to our ego, the more we elevate our consciousness, the stronger we become, the more we're able to accomplish in our life.
yeah, and so something that's been coming up in these dialogues is this idea of like coherence and seeking fields of coherence, and that when we tune into something greater than ourselves, right? We're kind of taking what may feel like a chaotic experience inside, but when we tune into a greater coherence, then our vibration kind of matches that coherence, right? And so
Absolutely.
I'm thinking about this in terms of the soul and the ego, and that within us, the soul has this like biomorphic resonance, right? Like our soul is actually in what I think of as like the seed of our spirit that is actually like our field of coherence, right? So everything within nature, life has this biomorphic field, right? Because like the seed of an oak tree makes an oak tree, not a pine tree, right? And so it's like the soul of Maggie makes a Maggie, not an Anna, right? But but if society is telling me, well, Anna is superior to Maggie because of X, Y, and Z, right? Then I start kind of diminishing myself, right, in order to be like you. And that, in my perspective, is the ego mind that's telling me that. The ego is saying, well, if I was thinner, if I was richer, if I was this, I would be happier or I would be better, right? And I believe the ego is actually trying to, will do a lot of things. I think that there is an evolutionary function of the ego that is trying to kind of make us always strive for more. And I think there's also this protective nature of the ego. But there are also kind of these detrimental parts where the ego is very judgmental and critical. And that when we then turn those judgments and criticism onto our soul, which is what a lot of us experience, especially through our educational system, a lot of us in our families, because we have a very, because of our modern society, right? We're so exposed to marketing, how we're supposed to be. We're constantly getting these messages of what the ideal life is, right? Keeping up with the Kardashians, whatever that is, right? And so that can all like, the ego can really like overpower our soul, I feel, right? Very easily. And so could you speak to, are there techniques or things that you would suggest for like, how do we kind of empower that voice of our soul so that our natural coherence is kind of field of coherence is like expanding, if that makes sense?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think the key is always to have that pause, especially if you have certain patterns. If your patterns, because usually people's ego patterns are individual and unique to them, like they can fall prey either to jealousy a lot, anger a lot, hatred a lot, fear a lot, whatever your pattern, to recognize that. And if you happen to fall into fear, to recognize, what are my triggers? What causes me to have fear? What am I fearful of? What's the worst case scenario? And then as you go into that fearful place, whenever you go there, to take that pause and just before you go and before the spiral of the mind happens, say, okay, I have a choice right here. I can be fearful. And if I be fearful, I'm going to be doing that which I usually do. And I'm going to be going down the same path that I usually take. But I have a choice and I can take a different path. And what would that look like? And what in that case you're doing is you're asking yourself, what's the opposite of fear? How do I go against my nature? The way that we can, as human beings, elevate our consciousness and align with our soul as opposed to our ego is going against our nature. If our nature is to be fearful, the opposite of fear, it's actually not courage. It's either love or it's faith. And courage, by the way, is not the lack of fear. Courage is being able to move forward despite fear. And so if fear is the thing, you take a pause and you're like, okay, so I can go down the spiral, or I could do what? What would it look like if I wasn't fearful? What would a loving act look like? What would a faithful act look like? What would a courageous act look like? What would I do if fear wasn't present? And then you do precisely that. But you don't just do it once. You start to get your muscle built in order to go against your nature, the going against your nature muscle. You do that also for anger. You go against your nature. If you tend to get angry, what can you do to go in the opposite direction? To take a pause, to go and calm yourself down and respond with patience as opposed to anger. If you want to be vengeful, how rather than being vengeful, can you be forgiving? How do you learn and train yourself to forgive as opposed to wanting this person to die or whatever it is? So those are all ways. It's learning how to go against your nature and learning how to elevate your soul through that process.
Yeah. And I think that that's where these practices or techniques of meditation or being in nature, anything that brings about greater awareness, right? Because that is such a huge part of any behavioral change, I think, is like you first have to develop the awareness so that you can slow down the kind of automatic response system within your being and be like, wait, oh, I feel it coming. It's coming. And then you have that moment where you can really be like, okay. And that's why breathing is so important, right? It's such an amazing way to integrate and be like, okay, I'm going to slow down my heart rate by breathing. I'm going to get more present in my body. I'm going to become aware of my thoughts, and I'm going to choose a different response because I have that power, right? As a human,
Absolutely.
I don't have to go down. But without the awareness, we really don't even have that choice to make a different decision,
That's exactly
right?
right. It all begins with the awareness. That's right. And the recognition and recognizing what your patterns are and having clarity on, okay, this is what I'm struggling with, but also having compassion for yourself, for your struggle, because you are human. You're not going to escape the ego in this lifetime, most likely. You're not going to be a Buddha or a saint. Perhaps you will be, and that's wonderful. But that's not even the goal. The goal is to recognize that you have that choice and to recognize that you're able to go above and beyond the other patterns of your past.
Now, I know, Anna, that you've done an extensive amount of travel and studied a lot of different spiritual traditions. And I'm wondering from that, is there kind of an experience of a spiritual journey that you would want to share with us? Or um, just to kind of like illuminate, some of your amazing experiences you had?
Sure. Yes. No, I have traveled the world. I've been to about 60 countries, working, traveling, researching, living. And this was all as I was training to be a psychiatrist, learning about how different people live, how different people want to understand or seek to understand happiness, depression, anxiety, what it means, how it's treated, how people heal. That's really what opened me up to spirituality, because I realized that the tools of my profession, and I had the top training, Stanford, Yale, NYU. It was amazing training, and yet it wasn't helping everybody. There were people who were falling through the cracks, who weren't getting the treatment that they needed for depression, for anxiety. And so I went out looking for other ways to heal. And it also was very personal to me, because I felt like I encountered my own so-called dark night of the soul when I was dating this man and found out that he was dating all these other people. And then things weren't working out at work at the same time. And I go into the detail of all this, in a lot of detail in my book. But the bottom line was, it was a total heartbreak on every level. And so I turned to the tools of my profession. I was like, this is not helping. I need something different. So I went and started, traveling and looking, like, how do I heal myself? What do I do to turn this around? How do I help myself to feel better? And that's when I started learning Buddhist meditation in Thailand and Kabbalah in Israel, and started working with different shamans in South Africa and South America, and really just started recognizing all the different forms of healing. And ultimately, in the course of this, started connecting to my own soul. Now, soul is an interesting concept, because in medical school, you're taught about the body, the brain, the mind, maybe the heart, but not really the soul. What is the soul? People like to use the soul of medicine, but like, what really is soul? And it was that question that led me in part on some of my journeys. And my favorite answer, by the way, to that question came from one of the shamans with whom I worked in Mexico, Fernando Broca. And his answer was that the soul is actually made up of two components. The first component is that the soul is that which connects you to everything and everybody else in the world. People often say we're one unified soul, and that's what they mean. The
Mhm.
second part of our soul is that which encapsulates your uniqueness. So that which is a unique combination of your talents, skills, abilities, interests, and that which only you can bring into the world. And so in this way, your soul is at once your interconnectedness and your uniqueness, what makes you separate and what makes you connected. And I thought that was just so beautiful and so meaningful. So in trying to understand the soul, I felt I became more connected to my own soul and started to live more authentically. I changed, some things in my life and what I was doing. And that's also what's motivated me to help my patients to connect more deeply to their soul and figure out, who are they? How is their life matching who they want to be? And what steps do they need to take to live more authentically and more true to their soul?
Yeah. And I think that is beautiful because we have this collective, I think the Greek called it like the anima mundi, which is like actually the collective soul of all of nature, like all that is on the planet, right? And then we have this individual piece of that, I would say, and which has its own expression. And what do you think? I'm just feeling inspired to ask this, like, what do you think when you see people who are not living from that place of their soul? Like, what is kind of the state of that person?
Yeah. So it's a great question, because that could manifest in many different ways. Because to actually connect to yourself and live from your soul, It's a very deep place, but not everybody has the luxury to do that, because it really is, sometimes you come into a family or a country where the obligations placed upon you are such that it's hard to take a breath and say, what do I really want? That's kind of a, flagrant question, or a question that really not everybody has the choice to ask. But often in our country, we're very lucky. We do have the luxury of being able to ask that question. And if we do have that luxury, but we choose not to ask that question, it could present as depression, anxiety, unexplained headaches, feeling out of, sorts, not feeling connected to your purpose, not really knowing who you are, confusion. So those are the states in which people often present to me as patients. And with them, I help them to connect and really get to the bottom of what's really at the root of what you're feeling. Now, by no means does everybody who presents with anxiety, depression, obsessions is not, they're not all disconnected from the soul. That's not always the case. Sometimes
Yes.
it is something
Yes.
that is biomedical, and there's a very strong genetic component. And so medication could help much more so than soul work. But for a lot of people, they've tried all that, but they still feel disconnected. And so the question is, how do they get more in touch with their soul? How do they bring that which is within their unconscious into consciousness in order to live more truly? And that's what I like to work with my patients on.
Yeah. Now, I find that the best way for me to do that is to create space. Like, I first have to create space in my day. And then for me, that is also a process of kind of daydreaming.
Mm-hmm.
Is one of the best ways, for me to feel like I'm getting in touch with my soul or my deeper desires, or these kinds of things. Because if I'm staying in the dailiness of the to-do list, right, and the responsibilities and all of those things, I'm not really able to, it's at a different brain frequency, right, than actually being able to drop into where my soul would be able to communicate with me. So could you maybe talk about that part of
Yeah,
it?
yeah. You make such a good point, Maggie. You're right on, because how do you connect to your soul? Often connecting to your soul isn't just connecting to your soul, it's actually disconnecting from all those things that disconnect you from your soul, such as the soul voice is a still quiet voice. And often that voice can only be heard when we temporarily silence the other voices, which are often screaming. And that is the voice of our mind. And that could chatter, 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 those incessant thoughts that often don't stop. That could also be the voice of our emotions, because they could be so strong and overwhelming. Sometimes emotions can guide you towards your soul, but sometimes they guide you away, because emotional responses could be habitual and aren't really putting you in touch with your highest, and best good, which is connected to your soul, and which is what your soul really needs and wants. And so you're exactly right that the way to connect to your soul is to create that space and to temporarily quiet the other voices, so that that still quiet voice can come to the forefront. So the voice of your soul is also the voice of intuition. And intuition comes to people in various ways. It's not just a voice, because that's one way that intuition can come to you as a voice, and that's called clairaudience. But there's other ways that people get their intuitive hits, right? So for some people, their intuition comes just as a sense of knowing, and that's called claircognizance. For other people will see, they'll have a vision in their mind of what they need in terms of what their soul needs. That's clairvoyance. For other people, they'll feel it in their body. That's called clairsentience. So those are just a few of the ways in which you could know, and which you can be in touch with your intuition. And everybody's different, and everybody receives information from their soul, which I also want to emphasize. Your connection to your soul, a lot of people say, is your connection to the divine. So the way in which you connect to your divinity or your something greater is through that intuitive sense. So it's really important to know how you receive and how you pick that information up.
Yeah, and now I want to add that I think dream work can be another aspect of really tuning into your soul as well. And I took a class in Jungian dream work, and it was so fascinating to really we would like draw our dream, and then people would ask us questions about our drawings. And so from there, it became like such an interesting process of really taking a dream that felt very significant and looking at the nuances of it to really get like how our soul is speaking to us. And like I'm still curious. I had this interesting dream last night where I was swimming, and I've always been a really good swimmer, but like I couldn't really get my swim. Like I was doing breaststroke, but I couldn't really get my stroke down. And then I woke up and I was laughing to myself, kind of like, I wonder if it's because it's kind of unnatural to actually swim. I've been having swimming dreams. Actually, I'm just remembering like another swimming dream I had like 2 weeks ago. But anyway, in this dream, I was like, I wonder if it's because I'm sleeping, because a lot of times I'm very aware in my dreams. So anyways, it's total side note, but
And sometimes swim dreams are water, rebirth, there could be all sorts of, yeah. And rebirth can sometimes be, a little difficult, or a little bit like we could be a little bit off in our rebirth. And yeah,
yeah, right. And so looking at the dreams as also as messengers, right? Or as information from our soul is a very kind of ancient and cross-cultural thing to do. So, maybe having a journal by your bed where you can actually write down your dreams and look at them at deeper levels. Um,
definitely, definitely. Sigmund Freud said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious. And so, just as so many other things can, like intuition and, that still quiet voice can enable you to tap into your unconscious, so could your dreams. So you're right on.
So, one other thing I want to bring up, because this is another thing that's been kind of a recurring thing that I do, is that I'm always, because I'm very, I want to say connected to nature, but that doesn't even make sense. Like, I feel at one, right, with nature, whatever. Um, I like to look at nature as a messenger, right? And so, in the practice of like kind of like eco psychology or these kinds of things, and so I I look at like if like one day we live on this acre on the ocean front. And so I'm super blessed because and we're on a river. We're like on a river and then and so we're on this like bird super highway, right? But this one day, this cormorant was in the front yard. And I was like, that's really interesting. Cormorant, it's actually an oddly large bird. And so we kind of helped it go to this wildlife center because it was obviously a little bit distressed. And so I was looking up. So then I'll go look up, like, well, what's the spiritual message of a cormorant, right? And learn about this bird that I didn't even really know existed. But it was very interesting because we, as humans, have this history with cormorants. They actually help the Japanese to fish, and they actually swallow rocks so that they can stay underwater longer, like a scuba diver. And so I kind of forget what the message was for me at this time around it. Oh, it's not the top of my mind. But, looking at like animals also as messengers can be like a guide in your path. So I'm bringing this up because last night, my daughter and I are standing at the front door, and she's saying goodbye to her nanny. And she's like, Mama, look at the big bird. And we look up in this tree, and about 50 feet from the front door is this bald eagle, like right in front of the front door. And I'm like, okay, that's a message, right? That's a message from spirit, especially because it was like directly in line with the front door. So it was like, oh, it's like bringing chi and blessings like into the house. And we stood there and watched it for like 15, 20 minutes, trying to see if it would fly away, but it didn't. It just stayed. And we like went and did a project, came back, it's still there, right? And so it was just like receiving that blessings of like, and I looked it up, and it was all about like pure spirit and reaching to higher levels of your life. And I start looking at my life, and I'm like, That's so interesting because I have been working for the last like 2 months in clearing out my father's condo because he passed away 5 years ago, but his partner had been living in the condo. And so I'm in California trying to clear out his house in Iowa. You can imagine, right? And during COVID and the whole thing, right? And so on the day that we basically get all the stuff out, this eagle comes. And so I really took it as like, oh, I'm elevating to another level in my life. And this bird is coming as like confirmation to that. And so I'm wondering in your cultural, I know this is a very long story, Anna. So thank you for listening. But I'm wondering, like, in your cultural studies, like, can you speak to, or did you encounter where people would look to nature as like a messenger in their journey?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's brilliant. And we have a book, my husband and I, because we moved to Woodbury, Connecticut, and we used to be living in Manhattan, and we moved here because we both got COVID. We both overcame COVID. So we're like, the time has come. This was like,
Oh, wow.
COVID was the best thing that ever happened to us. We're saying, because it led us to a whole new life, which was a life in nature, because we moved to a country home here. And what you're describing so speaks to our experience, because we've been seeing these beautiful animals on our property all the time, including one day a bald eagle. And then we got this book by Ted Andrews called Animal Speak, that actually a dear friend of ours, Henry Levin, who has this foundation called the Pinhas Foundation, which provides animal healing. And actually, you should interview him for this if you are interested to get more people. He would be amazing for this. But anyways, we can talk about that later.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
so, but the whole idea is that in the same way that anything that comes into your life can be a synchronicity or a sign or form of your unconscious, manifestations in a way, so can animals. And the Native Americans believe that different animals have different meanings. And I believe the bald eagle is new beginnings or something of that nature, because my
Mhm.
husband saw a bald eagle the other day and looked it up. And we have a hawk that we've seen. We've seen white-tailed deer. We saw a bear one day. We saw a fox that lives on our property. And it's just amazing to be with animals and to
Mhm.
commune with them. And what you can also do, I mean, if you're a spiritual person, you ask, do you have a message for me? And you see what comes in. And especially, when it comes to you more than once. And we have also a red shoulder hawk, or red, yeah, like a really neat hawk that we've named her Harriet. She lives around here and she just like hangs out, but she's let us know that this is her property, not ours. So we got to be careful, and she's the boss. But I think it's amazing. And also, we as human beings, we want to control nature, we want to control everything. But no, it's like the idea of sharing and being able to get messages from animals and from Mother Nature and from, higher consciousness. It's a beautiful way of living your life where you see yourself in the center. You just see yourself as one of all the
Mm.
interconnected beings and pieces of life. And life is just a little bit more peaceful in that way. I like it much more.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about that for just a minute, because I find when I shift out of that from this, Maggie centered life or whatever, to this interconnected experience of life, I feel a sense of being like held. Like you
Mhm.
start, and I'm going to bring in quantum physics for a minute just because I love it so much. And
Mhm.
that is that when we think of ourselves like, kind of like a heliocentric, right, perspective of the world, it's like, it's like, I feel like we shut out all of these miracles and possibilities, and we're kind of telling the universe, like, no, I'm in control. I got this. And I don't really need like help or distraction. Whereas when I settle into a more, and it's a very much relaxed way of holding my consciousness, if that makes sense. You kind of have, your eyes are a little bit defocused. You're a little bit like in your back body, if that makes sense. You're a little bit more in your, you know, parasympathetic nervous system. And in this place, there's like a dance with the universe that happens, right? And these little like um I'm just thinking of like the other day, I'm at the grocery store with my daughter and I pick up a bag of bagels because she wanted something from the grocery store. I didn't really need anything, but I was like, well, bagels, they're always good to have, right? So let's pick up some bagels. And so now I have the bagels and they're just like in the front of my seat. I didn't get a bag or anything because it was like, that was all I got. And we see this man where I live, there's a lot of people who are, don't live in houses. And so I see this man and he has a sign says he's hungry. And so I'm like, oh, and I feel the impulse immediately, like the bagels are for him, right? So I give him the bagels, and my daughter's like, but mama, you need those bagels. We need those bagels. And I'm like, no, because see, we can go to the store tomorrow. We can get more bagels if we want more bagels. But this man, he doesn't have the ability to go get more bagels. So I felt like God, and I'm explaining this to her because we talk about God, and God is in everything all the time, everywhere, right? Not in a scary way, but in an omnipresence kind of way. And and so I said, well, I felt the impulse of God, and God said to give the man the bagels because we can go get more bagels. We could go get more bagels right now if we want, right? And she's like, okay, Mama, that sounds like a good idea. And I'm okay, so we give the man the bagels. But I'm bringing this up because and especially when I'm with my daughter, because I have to change my gears to be at that pace of a 4-year-old, um, I'm available to hear the message of God that says, give the man the bagels. The bagels were actually for him, they weren't for you. But when we're in
Beautiful.
that narrow, right? When we're in that ego, there's a narrowing of our consciousness, and we're like not available to hear that message, like, give the man the bagels, right? And in that, it brings me joy, it brings him joy, you know what I mean? Like, and so I'm wondering if you have any guidance for, again, how do we like expand that so we're available to hear?
Mhm.
We're available to hear the messages.
Absolutely. So you're talking about, the signs from the universe or synchronicities. And synchronicity is a term that psychiatrist Carl Jung coined a while ago to refer to meaningful coincidences, which could be anything, including, hearing a voice that is meaningful to you. And those are messages that, like you said, from God or from the universe or from your own soul or from your unconscious that you're open to actually hearing. You're able to bring the unconscious into your consciousness. Now, to live in accordance with those messages is very powerful. And we were talking before about intuition, that still quiet voice. That's really the same thing. Being open to those messages, which can present either internally as your intuition or externally as these little synchronicities. Like you have a sign, and that sign tells you, oh, I'm supposed to do this as opposed to this. Or, you see something on the radio or hear something on the radio and you know that it's meant for you. Or you pass this man and you actually realize the bagels were for him and you act accordingly. So those are ways of being tapped in. You can live a life that is very, very tapped in, and when you are guided by the divine, and you can also live a life that's completely devoid of that and still be perfectly happy, as many people are. You could live a very fulfilling, secular, not connected in that way life. The most important thing is that you feel fulfilled and you feel that you are doing what you're meant to do in this world and that you're being of service to people in some way, shape, or form. Now, as a psychiatrist, I also want to make the caveat that, those signs or like kind of hearing and feeling those voices, it's really important to be able to distinguish voices that serve you versus voices that harm you. Because I also see the opposite. People who hear these voices that are actually harmful, telling them to do bad things, telling them bad things about themselves, even thoughts that you're no good, you're not worthy of happiness. Those are the things we have to fight against. Sometimes those are
Yes.
self-destructive thoughts. And unfortunately, we live in a society where there really is oftentimes a bit or not a bit of a self-hatred epidemic. People don't love themselves enough. People blame themselves. People beat themselves up. People engage in self-destructive behaviors to punish themselves. That's very, very real in our society. And so it's important to recognize what the inner voice is telling you, where it's coming from, and to align with the voice that's actually in the service of yourself and not the voices that are self-destructive.
Yeah, 1,000%, right? Because that is also our free will choice, right? Like what we choose to align with. And I know from a past of having mental health how pervasive those thoughts can be. And I also want to encourage people, if you have those kinds of thoughts, you can get help. You can change that. It's not something you have to constantly live with. And to take action, to love yourself enough to make those changes so you don't have to live with that constant inner critical or self sabotage, whatever that we want to call that, but that voice that's not guiding us in a positive direction. Um, so just in like wrapping up this very knowledgeable and wisdom filled discussion, I would love to speak for a minute about, you know, the correlation between a spiritual journey and your book Fulfilled, and how those two principles relate to each other.
Yeah. So my book Fulfilled chronicles the journey of about 50 of my patients that I've had over 10 years, and how each of them has gone through different parts of their life to elevate their own soul and to find their spirituality. Sometimes it's very clear that it was a spiritual journey, but sometimes it wasn't spiritual at all. It was a psychological thing that they had to do, such as overcome fear or harness their personal power or release an addiction. And it's all those stories that hopefully people, as they read, they'll be able to relate to and use on their own path. Some of the stories are very spiritual and directly spiritual in nature, and the rest are more instructive and psychological. But all of them are stories of growth. And it also talks about a little bit of my spiritual journey that I share in the book. And the purpose of writing it was to help everybody who I'm not able to work with one on one to be able to have a spiritual journey and some guidance along the way. There's also a lot of exercises, and there's also meditations. I think I shared it with you. That was my like free gift for the seminar. Some
Beautiful.
meditations from the book.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Anna, for this conversation. And I'm just so in awe of all that you have done and contributed to the medical profession around this combination of spirituality and mental health, and kind of being a pioneer in that regard. And
It's a
I,
pleasure. Thank you, Maggie.
I would love to just take a moment and like breathe all of this in, integrate it into our body, and send it out as a prayer.
Mhm.
And may all beings everywhere be happy and free. And may our thoughts, words, and actions contribute to the happiness and freedom of all beings everywhere. And thank you for your contribution to the happiness and freedom of all beings everywhere, Anna.
Amen. Thank you, Maggie.
Thank you.